everybody, welcome back to Exponential Finance, the podcast covering finance, technology and innovation, from our home in Japan and beyond. In a world where rapid technological change makes building lasting strategies difficult, starting with why can be a powerful tool for anchoring an IT strategy. Learn how utilizing Simon Sinek's leadership paradigm helped one Japanese IT organization create a focal point in a sea of ever-evolving strategic imperatives, and how our guest adjusted the proven principles when joining a startup. Christopher Scheidel is a father, international Fortune 100 CIO, entrepreneur, and musician who enjoys finding solutions to complex problems in the finance and insurance industries. Most recently as Chief Information Officer and Vice President of MassMutual's Japan subsidiary, Christopher strengthened its IT organization, culminating in a successful acquisition with Japan's largest life insurer. And now, please welcome Christopher Scheidel, currently co-founder and CIO at Transaction Insights, where he is looking to provide financial services and insurance firms with a unique and powerful way to identify and navigate market changes.
Good morning, everybody from Asia. Good afternoon, good evening from those elsewhere. Really happy to be here today. So first off, I just want to kick off. This is not going to be a revelation. They might be surprised about what I'm going to present today. It's really not going to be anything revolutionary. In fact, a lot of it's going to be a confessional, but it's my hope that it'll really resonate with those, still in Japan and those in Asia working on leadership challenges in general. What I hope to do today is just share the concrete application of one of the leadership concepts that I personally found really valuable as I was working on some leadership issues in Japan. And I hope when we're done this morning, what we've done is connect the threads between the art and science of strategy through execution. So hope you enjoy today. A little bit about me. So my name is Christopher Scheidel. In my spare time, I am a technologist by trade, but I'm also a dad. And I also tell people I'm kind of a recovering CIO. I'm going to share today a little bit about applying a leadership framework to what I think is a real problem of developing and then maintaining a sustainable IT strategy. And what I'd like to challenge us all today to think about is I'd like to posit that doing so can actually be really simplified. And it doesn't need to be an overly complex exercise that's full of matrices, mappings, KRIs, dashboards. And you can kind of do it in a way that resonates with specific psychology of your organization and also of your teams. I'd also like to posit that you can do this in a way that works very practically and very demonstrably to get sustainable results for organizations that might be struggling with engagement. One quick disclaimer, I do want to put this out there. This is my own personal view. This doesn't represent the views of past employers. So just keep that in mind as well. It's really kind of a view from the CIO seat here. What I'd like to start with is just a little bit about me so you kind of understand the context. I've spent the first half of my 25 career in technology teaching financial institutions how to talk to machines as a programmer, developer, architect, and getting those machines to do what people wanted them to do. The second half of my career has really been about teaching financial institutions how to talk to their people and getting their people to do what they wanted them to do. And now my current gig, I gave up the corporate thing. I'm more in the startup world now. Very, very different for those of you that may know. My current gig is teaching machines how to talk to financial institutions, both literally and figuratively. It's a heck of a lot of fun. What we're going to do today, though, is talk about this concept that was born out of working in the corporate world and how I've somewhat applied it to the startup world. I'm not a good salesman, I'll admit that off the bat, but here's a quick pitch on what we do right now. I co-founded a company called Transaction Insights. I get the pleasure of building out the core technology and tech stack for this firm. It's a lot of fun. I get a lot more hands-on keyboards. But what we do is really simple. We read the news in real near time, and we distill this down to actionable insights for corporate strategy teams, venture capitalists, private equity firms, and more. Our launch focus this year was the FinTech ecosystem, where we currently provide a top 5 global bank with some information for their corporate development and merchant services divisions. And we also work with a couple consulting companies to monitor specific news on companies they support. We do it with a combination of at-scale computing, natural language processing, and augmenting AI with human expertise. So if you're interested, look me up on LinkedIn. You can go find all the information on the company. But I want to talk more about what I learned working in Asia over the past few years, but just want to give you the context of where I'm coming from here. All right, so I'm going to set the stage here, okay? For those of you who worked in IT, this is going to be kind of a joke. I want you to really stretch your imagination out here. I'm going to ask you to go out on a limb and conjure up, if you can believe it, an image of an IT organization with the following qualities. So in 2015, I was asked to come take over the leadership of an IT organization of a Japanese insurance subsidiary of an American company, about 150 people, including staff and vendors. The organization was very skeptical and burned out. I think there were 4 acting CIOs over the last 5 years, which is actually really impressive given that the average life of a CIO, I think, is like 4.3 years. It was transactional, surviving by delivering what's next, and not really able to deliver on long-range goals, including some pretty gnarly technology problems. And in fact, a source of pride, psychological pride for this organization, was their ability to continue to deliver under what would otherwise be really crippling organizational conditions. Their priorities were changing constantly because of the nature of the business. This, combined with that transactional nature I just mentioned a moment ago, actually created a lot of consternation within the organization. At the time, we had many career managers who were really technically good at what they did and understood the insurance business very well, but they didn't necessarily know or have the tools yet to drive cultural change. And unfortunately, this organization at that time as well, also produced a lot of major operational errors. For those unfamiliar with the bank assurance model in this particular business, your customers are not only your end customers from an insurance perspective, but also major banks and securities firms. So when a mistake is made, you're actually making a mistake to your distributors as well, which can have a large reputational impact. But all was not lost. There were some green shoots here of encouragement that were at the outset. So the first was, this was a wholly owned subsidiary. So the company was actually pretty autonomous, which is rare for a lot of foreign owned companies in Asia. It was also small enough for the organization to be able to make independent decisions. So that means independent funding decisions, independent technology decisions. There was an emerging acceptance of new ideas. Fortunately, the CEO had been Western trained, working in a lot of Western companies. And a lot of the other executive vice presidents in the company had an openness to potentially doing things differently. More importantly, we had a lot of team members with really deep knowledge and expertise. And then finally, when you think about some of the problems that can occur in IT organizations, many of the problems were not actually that complex. The solutions were readily available, but this was more of an organizational issue. So I don't want you guys to leave this presentation going, wow, show me this amazing technology strategy you built. It's not about that at all. It's really about how do you unstick an organization by using this particular technique. So first confession here. This entire approach that I'm about to describe to you was not planned. It was really an accident. I had grown up being an enterprise architect, being what we called like a business systems liaison. I've always worked by going with my gut and what fit my nature in the past as an analyst. So that would mean, inventory systems, inventory business drivers, prioritize, drive execution. I had an arsenal of tools. I like to consider it like my Batman tool belt in my back pocket. And I had a laptop that with all this information on it, that would make this thing a slam dunk. And I had just spent prior to this about 4 years working in an investment context, brand new domain with these new tools, and we were pretty successful. So as I took a step back and started working with the executive team and working with my staff, I looked at this space and I say, this is very complex and there's something missing. So as I started to put that plan together, I realized that what I was doing, what I naturally went to, was entirely too complex and was missing some of the simplification that I thought would actually help resonate with a Japanese audience. The other thing I should point out, by the way, and for those of you who are accustomed to working in Japan, this company was really unique because though it was foreign owned, I can confidently say over 99% of the staff were Japanese nationals. And I'm not saying that from a mindset perspective, but just more from an organizational expectation perspective. It's very difficult to come in with, Western philosophies for how to apply leadership concepts and think that they're going to resonate right away. And I feared this as well for the analysis that I had done at the outset of this organization. So I actually stopped my entire process internally. And I started with a simple question. I said, why am I here? What is my role to actually help this organization and these people? And then how am I going to ensure that I remain happy in my leadership role over my 4.3 years as a CIO, if I can make it that far? So I like to think that this sort of epiphany came as I was, hiking up Mount Fuji. But it was actually inspired by reading Simon Sinek's Start With Why. This was a book I had read before, but I had recently reread through my notes as I was planning my transition to Japan. And it contains such a simple concept that at the time when I read the book, I really didn't know how to apply it. But it was the cornerstone for the strategy that we employed to move forward with this company. And this is what I'd like to share with you now. The second confession I have for you guys here is this is actually not rocket science, and it's not even really original work. So Simon Sinek, for those of you who are unfamiliar, I'll bring you through this process really quick here so we don't belabor it too much. He's an ethnographer by training, but he's made a career out of helping companies and people achieve more. He has a stated goal of building a world in which the vast majority of people wake up every day feeling inspired, safe at work, and feel fulfilled at the end of the day. He gave this really popular TED Talk in 2009, which went viral, and then he published a book and other books. A lot of people will maybe criticize Sinek to say, he's kind of repetitive, like a lot of people who develop these types of leadership frameworks. And however valid or invalid that criticism may be, I think the core concept actually has a lot of value. And Sinek himself actually admits that it's the world's simplest idea. For us to get grounded here, I'd just like to take, maybe 2 or 3 minutes here to go through those key concepts, and then we'll bring it to brass tacks and go through how we implemented this here. Simon argues there's 2 ways to influence an organization: inspiration and manipulation. He deems that both are effective. I think we can all think of times where we've used inspiration or manipulation to get what we wanted. But he argues that inspiration is truly the only sustainable approach. One way to think about it is getting repeat business through price discounts versus loyalty. The difference between repeat business through price discounts and boiling it down to the common denominator and perhaps loyalty is that if you have loyalty and you're motivating people with loyalty, people will keep coming back despite higher prices and mistakes. For those of you who have been Apple fans for a long, long time, I'm sure you could probably remember periods of about 5 years where Apple was kind of going off the trail and then coming back. We'll get back to Apple in a second, actually, because they've got a really interesting story that fits in here. And manipulation works. We do it all the time. You see it in pricing, you see it in sales promotions, you see it in bonuses, incentive schemes, etc. But Simon argues that it's not sustainable. And the reason why is because there's a big difference between leading with inspiration and manipulation in terms of where leaders put their focus. And this is the core concept here. So he argues about the golden circle. Every organization knows what they do, the product or service they offer. He argues that some companies know how they do it, how they're different, but very few companies actually know why they do what they do. And oftentimes it's not to make money, that's the result. The why is really, why do you get out of bed every morning? What's the company's purpose? Why should people care? Most organizations will communicate from the outside in. This is sort of the default way, and then have some call to action. So in the case of Apple, he makes the argument, we make great computers, they're beautifully designed, easy to use, want to buy one? Okay, maybe. But people don't buy what you do in the end, they actually buy why you do it. So he argues that leaders and organizations that communicate from the inside out are actually leading through inspiration. And he gives a very unique perspective from Apple Computer. He says inspiring organizations start with why, and they work their way out. So an example of Apple, everything they do, they believe in changing the status quo, thinking differently. The way they do that is they design products that are beautiful and easy to use, and they just so happen to make computers. You want to buy one? The why engages you emotionally, while the what and the how serve as the evidence for the belief. So that's the key concept. One other key point here I just want to point out is that Sinek argues that true differentiation, be it business results or org performance, occurs in the connection and the coherence between the why and the how, not the how and the what. This is really involved in building trust. And for those of us who have worked in Asia, we can understand that trust typically takes longer to build. It's much harder to build it at the same speed you would in perhaps European or North American or South American organizations. And it can be much easier to lose. So building trust is achieved when there's that consistency of communication between why, how, and what. And the feeling of success, either personal success or organizational success, is ultimately tied to the why. The what is just the achievement that you see or the outcome of the proof of that success. I think a lot of us could probably think of people who make a lot of money, have a nice apartment, get everything they want, but still flop through life feeling unsatisfied no matter how much they actually achieve. It's because they're potentially measuring and managing to the what, not to the why or the how. So this was the key concept that we had used to build the strategy. We spent about 10 minutes talking about kind of these abstract concepts. I want to actually bring it now to what could you actually do to leverage these concepts to build an IT strategy for an organization in Japan. So in looking at this organization, the dichotomy was pretty stark. It was clear that it had been managed via manipulation in the past and not inspiration. So I thought this might be a good approach, but there were a few tenets that I kind of had to process and put in place first in order to make this work. The first was that I didn't want nor have time to teach a new management methodology to a team of 150 or more people, as well as a peer management team in a language that I'm not a native speaker in. I would need to do that just to get started. The second was that life was moving way too fast and there was no time for another fad by the fifth CIO to be truly absorbed and adopted. And in addition, we were also deploying other management techniques like huddles and visual management, which in my opinion were actually just a crutch so I could get visibility on the organization before we were able to deploy something more sustainable. The second one here, I say no executive speak. It had to be simple because our day-to-day operational language was Japanese. We needed to make sure that all the senior managers in the organization could latch onto a concept without having to learn a new language and a new vocabulary and a new conceptual framework. And then the last point is any methodology that was going to take a lot of time here was just destined to fail, and we would lose our opportunity to strike quickly. So we knew we had to move fast. Let's talk about why. Developing a why can be a very emotional exercise. It certainly was for me. It's probably actually the most difficult part of this process. My personal why started with the following philosophy of my view as organizations, not as pyramids, but as trees. And this is not a unique or original idea. It's just one that really resonates with me. In my view, organizations are more like trees. I thought about my branch as the CIO and what I'm here for. My role is to provide nutrients and support ultimately to our senior management team, who them and of themselves are supporting the staff. And the staff are the folks that are doing the majority of the day-to-day work, and that's ultimately where the fruit from the tree is produced. When you look at an organization from this perspective, it changes your approach on what you value as a leader and how you bring your value to an organization ultimately to support its objective. And I spent a lot of time sharing this personal philosophy over a period of about 6 months before we even started the strategy process to our senior management team. Ultimately, what we did is we took those ideas and started a conversation around why were people coming into work. Now, I won't tell you that ultimately we aligned on everybody having the same why. I think that's kind of impossible. But what we found is ultimately a few tenets that resonated with the organization. I'll actually show you the actual two that we landed on. The first was, and many people in IT I think can resonate with this, IT professionals in general are in a really unique position because they're at the center of a transformation that's happening in all industries that is increasingly relying on technology. So what a cool place to be as a professional if you have a role working with nearly every single part of the organization. We felt highlighting this as an organization would be a great motivator. Our IT professionals are at the center of this, and they have an opportunity to contribute to what the company's trying to achieve from multiple perspectives. That's a really cool starting point. And I actually shared with the team, that's one of the reasons why I was getting up in the morning. That's one of the reasons why I moved to Japan to help this team out. The second was a little more personal, that we believe that our people deserve to have their efforts directed towards meaningful and challenging work that both satisfies them through growing their careers and growing their intellectual curiosity, but of course, as a baseline, satisfies the need to grow the business and achieve its business objective. These two items became our why. And what was really interesting is we didn't use the phrase why. I think if I recall correctly, we actually used the phrase core beliefs. And I think through deep conversations with the management team, we kind of talked about if we use the word why, is it actually going to resonate? And this is another key point. I think it's really important when you're working with a framework like this or any other leadership framework to make sure that the way you're talking about it with your teams actually resonates with the vocabulary that people use. The next part, talking about the how. If anybody has designed an IT strategy in the past, there's a little bit of science to it, of course, data collection, et cetera, but there always feels like there's this art part, right? Let's admit it, like sometimes it feels like you're just waiting for inspiration on a walk and you're kind of pulling the sword from the Lady of the Lake, like Excalibur. What we had here in this organization is we had a combination of employee survey results that we could lean on to help direct how we were going to get this work done. And one of the things that we had decided here is we were going to build our how. We decided on how would we know if our hows are actually successfully set. And the test that we set here is if we find the hows for our organization that could withstand the volatility in our business environment, then we knew we were on the right track. We had learned 4 things in our discussions with our teams and executive management teams. The first is we had the lowest employee survey results score of any of the organizations. And I think a couple of my managers were a little despondent when we first came in and I got the results a couple of months later. And I was kind of happy because I'm like, right, we're the lowest. We can only go up, right? This is awesome. So I kind of looked at it as a positive where other people may look at it as a negative. But it was clear that we need to spend more time listening to the voice of that team. The other aspect that we had delivered on our how as we began forming it is we knew we were capable of delivering business value while improving quality, but the direction of that work really needed some steering. The efforts in the past weren't coordinated and we're getting shortages of resources. Prior management teams were really afraid to say no to make room for the truly needed yeses. This model of bank assurance was moving very quickly at the time. I think it still is. And we couldn't change the pace of shifting gears to remain competitive in our markets, kind of like changing the wheels on the bus while it's actually still rolling. And I think at that time we had an industry-leading cycle time, but it was mostly due to an overworked IT team. We knew we could sustain that, but we just knew we had to do it differently. So changing the way we do that work became another pillar of the how in this strategy. And then lastly, we had a massive underinvestment in cybersecurity. So I wanted to make sure we were rolling this in. Due to our business and growing needs, we really need to shore that up. But rather than put cybersecurity as a focus of the strategy, we worked to reframe this as a how, again, that could withstand the test of time. And it ultimately became a very simple statement about protecting our customers and distributors. A few observations on the how. These observations about working with our teams and some of the problems ultimately became the how, which ultimately became our pillars. And again, back to the whole language issue, you kind of look at it from Sinek's framework point of view, this becomes our how, but ultimately in our strategy, this became our pillars. Now, one of the key things with the how here is to make sure that you're defining your outcomes and measurements to the how, not necessarily to the what. That's a really key point in sustaining this beyond, which we'll talk about in one moment here. So what we attempted to do here is define what outcomes we're attempting to achieve with each of these hows, and those outcomes were directly aligned. So in the case of listening to the voice of our team, what should we expect to see? We should expect to see improved satisfaction with work. In case of making sure we're focused on the right work, we should see larger contribution to sales and net operating income. Improving the way we do things, we should become more efficient in our work processes. And from a protecting customers and distributors point of view, we should be able to identify and remediate more critical company risks. Developing the what, let's move on to the what here. The what became an exercise for managers to conduct to allow them to become familiar with the framework. I'll be honest, the how and the why were ultimately done with myself and our senior leadership team and some of our group managers at the time. But the what, we began including more of the organization. I want to talk first about alignment. So we worked for alignment to our how and made sure that there was a very clear path from what, how, and why as we move forward. The other aspect of setting the what was the expectation of change. One of the big things that we heard from our team is they felt like they were getting whipsawed every time a new CIO came in or every time a new distributor asked for something new. We knew that the what in our business, we were not going to be able to control how volatile that was. So that what would have to constantly change within our business over time. And we had to build that feature into the strategy. We also wanted to focus on achievement. It was really important to note, however, that of course results had to be achieved. So we asked line leaders, what are you going to do to actually support these pillars and put them in the driver's seat? And then the other thing we really had to focus on was conflict resolution at the senior management level. You can't always do everything all of the time. And the last point I wanted to point out here is shared objectives. So objectives are set at both the top level and department level, but then ultimately were rolled up into a single set of departmental objectives. One of the examples you can think of is drawing up a portfolio management process. That might help you do a better job of working on the items that matter. Another example of the what here might be to invest in critical and competitive skills. Can we do that all the time at the same pace? Probably not, but we should still be focused on listening to the voice of our team and focusing on the work that actually matters. So these became our objectives. The other thing that's important to understand here is the projects and initiatives that support these what objectives. That was a more mechanical alignment of individual projects and initiatives that ultimately support the work that we were trying to achieve. They were not included in the strategy here on purpose, and we actually didn't include them in our strategy documents. And the reason why is because we wanted to reinforce the fact that, and be very explicit, that these are very dynamic in nature. So you can often say, all right, here's our plan for the year, and know that that plan is going to change drastically when funding change or business conditions change. And by defining the strategy around this framework, we got out of the mode of feeling like we were reinventing our strategy every time the business conditions changed and focused more on how the individual elements were supporting that business strategy over time. I'm not going to go through all the things that we did, in detail. That's probably boring and not appropriate, but I do want to kind of walk it through piece by piece so you kind of understand how these things are connected. So here's a great example. We already talked about people deserving to have their efforts directed towards meaningful and challenging work. That was our why. One of the hows that support that is focusing our resources on the work that matters. One of the key pillars that we had put in place here in terms of the what was improving the quality of IT finance, project management to promote better business decisions on IT expenditures. And one of the projects or initiatives that actually supported that was enhancing the portfolio budgeting process. So the really cool thing about this is when you stop by and you're talking to the leader managing this project, you say, hey, why are we enhancing the portfolio budgeting process anyway? Why does this matter? You can kind of walk it up the chain. And the conversations become less around, what are we doing to enhance the portfolio budgeting process when there's a problem, but more of, are we still doing the right thing to focus our resources on the work that matters? Are we still doing the right thing to improve quality of IT finance? The goal, said simply, with all of this was to change the platform from which we communicate. So every conversation around strategy starts with why and then extends to the how. The core beliefs and the pillars become the foundation for communication. This becomes a very simple framework. It's easy to understand. Here's a really cool part. You go to a nomikai, right? You can have a conversation in a bar on these 6 points without remembering a huge strategy deck. I mean, that in and of itself is actually a really great value add because you can have conversations with more junior members of the team and actually talk through this and get their opinions. So it becomes a really great way to ground yourself in a foundational strategy without having to overly design it in a complex way. Again, the measurements here are really based on the pillars. That's another key one. So when we talk about end of year reviews, you talk about personal performance, you talk about company performance, you talk about IT performance. All of those metrics ultimately get built around these pillars. And what the really cool outcome of this is sometimes you generate these metrics and you're not really sure if you have the right metric. And many of you know, read anything about management, you're going to get the results that you measure, right? So if you're measuring the wrong thing, you could potentially get the wrong results. So the nice thing about this is it actually tightly couples the measurements with the how, not necessarily did we complete on that project on time? Yes, of course, that's important. But are we actually focusing our people on the work that matters, and what is the evidence for us doing that? So those measurements become completely grounded in a different aspect of the strategy. And then finally, the execution is measured against the objectives, not necessarily the individual projects or initiatives. So that's kind of a walkthrough. I'd like to talk a little bit about the results. All right, so let's talk about the results here. So I mentioned before that we had the lowest engagement survey results scores. Over the following 2 years, I believe we had the most improvement in those scores. So we didn't make it all the way up to the top, but we certainly had the most improvement. I like to think we were the comeback kid or the bad news bears winning the title at the end of the year, but still not the best team. At the end of my tenure in this organization, it culminated in an acquisition. One of the really interesting features about this strategy is we have very open discussions about what it means to people. So as that acquisition was happening, we knew very clearly those who were planning to potentially leave the organization and those who would stay. And during the acquisition process itself, the IT organization had one of the lowest turnovers of any of the organizations, despite the news being out 8 months before the completion of the deal. We had a great reduction in unplanned overtime. We were judicious about where we needed to apply overtime now. We were able to make better decisions and ultimately resulted in about 75% reduction of unplanned overtime. And we also saw overall risk reduction. We were able to focus on some longer term items and tie it back to protecting customers and distributors. And I'll be honest, this result was largely due to the focus of the strategy, not within the IT team, because they get it. They understand the need for this investment, but with the senior management team, my peers. Through talking about protecting our customers and distributors and understanding the importance of that strategy, we were able to secure not all, but most of the necessary funding needed to make significant progress on that initiative. And then perhaps most importantly, we did see over those 2 years ongoing improved business delivery in terms of not only quality, but also date accuracy in terms of when do we plan on delivering that. So one of the things I did that was preparing for this discussion, I took a step back and say, why did this work? Was all of this attributable to this, amazing strategy we built? The reality is no, not all of it can be attributable, but I do think there were some key aspects that I want to share with you that I think are important to point out. So the first reason why I think this worked during this time period is it shifted the psychological focus of the organization from a mandate, I must do this because somebody told me to do it, to a reason. It's not about a single manager or a group of managers telling people what to do. Pillars and the objectives in the end would have largely been the same if we had taken a more traditional approach to building an IT strategy. But said simply, the strategy was a lot more relatable now, it was more personal. And I think for trying to create an organization to get it stuck out of a rut and to move it forward, creating that personal connection for the members of the team was quite important. It created psychological stability for what I mentioned before, this IT team that had been whipsawed through prior leaders and crushing business delivery requirements. This concept was able to withstand, pretty large changes in the business environment without feeling like the bedrock for the strategy of the organization was also constantly changing. So it gave people an anchor to relate to moving forward. And the one that I really liked is it really simplified communication. So explaining IT strategy to my chief legal officer was a lot easier when I was using the same language I had used to build this strategy. It almost provided like a vocabulary with our executive sponsors, and it made those conversations more intuitive to those senior leaders and easier to get buy-in for large initiatives or key concepts that needed to be communicated laterally through the organization. So I was going to ask a sales organization to defer a particular investment for a period of 3 or 4 months so we could get something done in IT. Having a conversation at this level about the why and the how is a lot easier than saying, well, you see, this is part of our strategy. It's item 4B2. And we said we were going to do it, so we need to do it. It actually aided me in my discussions with my peers quite a bit. Lastly, results were measured against the how. I think in the end, we were very focused on making sure we were measuring the right things. Oh, of course, we still measured project delivery, on-time delivery, but those didn't become the focus for what we were trying to improve. And people, the team and the managers were more focused on changing the outcomes at the how level as opposed to the outcomes for any individual given project. And what was interesting is even though we weren't holding people accountable at that detailed level, those things automatically happened as a result of focusing 2 layers up. Now in the startup world I mentioned before, we kind of made this shift, or I made this shift last year. I started thinking a little bit about, how has this concept translated to a more fast and free, by the seat of your pants type business environment. Thinking about this, I think there were a couple things that really resonated with me. The first was criteria for choosing principal partners. If you're going to start a business with somebody or you're going to invest with folks, this concept can be very powerful as a criteria for choosing, who you choose to partner with. In fact, before I had started with Transaction Insights, I had about a month of deep discussions about why we're starting this company and what's the purpose and what are we going to be, not like why I want to make money or I think I can reach $1 million in revenue in 1 year, but what does this matter in terms of your life goals? The second, which is actually super important, is the hiring and onboarding strategy for a set of hires. Making sure that people are on board with what you're trying to achieve as an organization and what you're trying to achieve personally and professionally. This is especially important in a startup context where you're asking people to play multiple different roles. In a corporate context, you can kind of get away with having somebody not completely aligned if they're playing a very narrow role. In a startup context where you're asking somebody to be your head of social marketing, an analyst, and oh, by the way, I want you to do analytics in Python, having somebody who's motivated and understands the why of the organization is quite critical. And then the last one, when you're seeking early clients and partners, finding people who share your values and who share your vision for what you're trying to do can be extremely important. And it can actually direct your company in a completely different way. So if you're working with investors or you're working with early enterprise clients to help shape your product, having people who are on board with your why can be extremely powerful. To summarize, how do you move forward taking Sinek's concept and applying it to IT strategy? The obvious one, define your own why, but then take the time to define your organization's why. Discuss your how, make that an interactive exercise with your trusted managers. And remember that you're going to eventually measure your organization on your how. If your how is constantly changing due to your business environment, you're probably not defining it from the right perspective. The fourth item, to build buy-in, let your teams define the what. You'd be surprised, even the most timid teams that don't want to speak up, once they have that why and how framework, get very creative in terms of defining that what on their own. And it also helps with the natural buy-in process, and you find yourself having to do less consensus building over time. Organize and revise that what often. Make sure your team recognizes that what is going to change constantly, and it should change constantly if you're going to remain competitive. Make sure you're communicating from the why and the how. That means from the executive level to the management level to even in your open discussion meetings. Make sure you spend the time taking the 2 to 3 minutes to remind people you cannot over communicate these concepts to any audience, regardless of the culture. And then lastly, use language that your organization values. You don't have to necessarily use the words that Sinek used or even the way he breaks it apart. Take a look at how your organization has defined strategies in the past. Take a look at your industry and then adopt those words. You can essentially clothe this strategy into what works for your organization. So I'd like to conclude with a quote here. This is one of my favorite quotes by Matthew Kelly. He gave a really cool talk about change and transition about a decade ago. And he said, people love change. They actually really like to change and just don't like transition. I'd love to lose 10 pounds. I just don't want to do the work to get there. Part of our jobs as leaders, either company leaders or industry thought leaders, is to bring people and teams to a better place, to bridge the gap between where people are executing now and where they could potentially be executing. So, this is just one example of potentially how to do that. But, I encourage everybody, if you're in a leadership position or an influencer position, to continue to think about that and push to have your organizations perform better.